Welcome to the Eric H. Holder Jr. Initiative for Civil and Political Rights, and welcome to our 14th installment of the American Voter Project series. The past few months have provided a whirlwind of political events, turmoil, and spectacles that are really unprecedented, beginning during the summer with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the nationwide protests and movement for Black Lives, followed then in November by the election and the election of President Biden, followed then by the flipping of the Senate in January with the elections of Senators Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia, followed, as we all recall, shockingly, by the January insurrection and the taking of the Capitol, and then the second impeachment and the second impeachment trial of former President Trump, and now, of course, the first 100 days of the new presidency, but under times of pandemic. Any one of those alone would be enough for a full session of our American Voter Project. And when you add on top of that this week, the polar vortex that has wreaked havoc in Texas and throughout the country, I think any one of those episodes alone would be enough for us to talk about for an hour. We're going to be focusing on the most recent, really, on the second impeachment, on the first 100 days. But in order, with the others in context, and in order to really understand our evolving political landscape today, joining me to discuss this evening, we have three extraordinary public servants: the Honorable Donna F. Edwards, Attorney General Eric Holder, and the Honorable Beto O'Rourke. Let me introduce our three guests first, and then we'll get talking. Donna Edwards served 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, becoming the first African-American woman to represent Maryland. Congressman Edwards served in the House from June 2008 to January 2017. Prior to that, Congresswoman Edwards co-founded and led the National Network to End Domestic Violence and spearheaded the effort to pass the Violence Against Women's Act in 1994. Congresswoman Edwards is now senior advisor to the Bowman Foundation and a contributor to the Washington Post and the NBC, MSNBC channels. Thank you so much for joining us, Donna Edwards. Attorney General Eric Holder, of course, is our namesake. Attorney General Holder was Attorney General under President Barack Obama from February 2009 to April 2015. He was the third longest serving Attorney General in the history of the United States and the first African-American to hold that office. And his service as Attorney General capped 30 years of public service in the Department of Justice under Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Reagan. Of course, Eric Holder is a dear friend of us at Columbia, a graduate of Columbia College, 1973, a graduate of Columbia Law School, 1976. And so we're thrilled to have you back with us. And on that theme, we are also delighted to welcome home Beto O'Rourke, Columbia College 1995, who graduated from right here with a BA in English Literature and was a proud member of the heavyweight rowing crew, co-captain in 1994, if I'm not mistaken. Congressman O'Rourke served in the House from January 2013 to January 2019 and represented Texas's 16th district. Prior to that, he was mayor pro tempore of El Paso, mayor and member of the El Paso City Council. He was a Democratic candidate for president in 2020. And before that, in 2018, he had set the record in his campaign for the US Senate for the most votes ever cast for a Democrat in Texas history. So welcome back, Beto. And before we go any further, actually, and start the panel, I just wanted to say that we are all thinking of you and your family and your fellow Texans during this terrible storm week. And quickly just wanted to check in, make sure everything's okay with you and your family there in Texas, and find out how things are going before we start the conversation. Everything going all right?
Bernard, thank you. Our family, thank God, is well. The people of El Paso, who are in the far west part of the state of Texas, largely have been unaffected by the power outages and the problems that we have in water supply in the rest of Texas. But please keep your thoughts and prayers and actions focused on Texas. There are millions who are going right now without clean drinking water, hundreds of thousands without electricity. There's a lot of suffering and pain in Texas right now. If you can help out with our food banks at Feeding Texas or the Texas Red Cross or Texas Salvation Army, these are three great resources that a large number of my fellow Texans are relying on right now. So thank you for asking about us, and please continue to keep that focus on Texas. We could use it.
Thanks, Beto, and thanks for telling us the three organizations that we can contribute to. Actually, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us under these conditions. So as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on the second impeachment and the first 100 days in this extraordinary context of the pandemic, and with the other events kind of in our mind as context. But all of that to get a handle on the evolving political landscape today. And I'd like to open the panel by asking each of you, Donna, Eric, Beto, what you think is really is most important about the situation we are in politically in these first 100 days. So let me start with you, Donna Edwards.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. It's actually good to be back and to be with these great panelists we have this evening. I've been thinking about this a good bit, because I think, when we look back, I remember when I came into Congress in 2008 and Barack Obama and Joe Biden were sworn in, and we were in the middle of that, great recession. We had to really respond to it. It was a really tough environment, a lot of Americans out of work. But this time period is so remarkably extenuated, so much greater than what we faced in 2008. And so when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were sworn in, it was on the heels of all of those things that you outlined, through the election year, the Black Lives Matter movement, and leading up to obviously the election and the extension of that election by the antics of the former president. But the challenges that we face are really great. And I think it's been remarkable that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been really able to focus like a laser beam on the work that's at hand. And that is, as they've said, tackling the pandemic and then trying to get a hold of getting people back to work and really reinvigorating the economy, even as all of the impeachment drama was proceeding. And I think there was some debate among Democrats about whether to proceed with an impeachment. But frankly, for our democracy, I'm actually glad that they did, because I think that while there was a division of labor with the administration focused on moving forward, but the impeachment managers and the senators really focused on that impeachment and laying out the case. I thought it was, the managers did such a spectacular job of laying out, the scope of the harm that was committed against the democracy and the reason that people should care about it. And I think the American people made their own decision. And what that did was it actually opened up the space for Joe Biden and for Kamala Harris to keep on with the business of running the nation. And I think that that's been important. Now we will see in the day, and we'll talk about this, but in the days leading up through this 100 days, whether that really translates into legislative victories, but really victories for the American people who want to see us deal with this pandemic, and lots of Americans who want to get back to work and get back to school and grow the economy.
Thank you, Donna. Yeah, that's great. And that's really kind of tees up a question we're going to want to address today, which is, how much of the agenda can we think might get through, as you were suggesting. So thanks for that. And I think you framed it really well in terms of the division of labor and how that has gotten us to the point where we are now with the president and the vice president so focused on their positive agenda. Thanks so much. Eric Holder, what do you think? How do you kind of diagnose this moment?
Well, I mean, I think you can look at it kind of substantively, and then I think politically, and I think Donna had it right. The primary substantive things are obviously dealing with the pandemic, getting the economy working again. But the question is, I think politically, what kind of Republican Party are we going to be dealing with? I just saw something. Steve Scalise went to Florida to kiss the ring. He met with Trump. What kind of calculations have they made? Is Trump going to still be? All the polls indicate he's still a force. Is McConnell trying to push away from him? Are House Republicans going to embrace him? Do they think that's the path back to the majority? But I also think not enough attention's been focused on the Democrats. I mean, we talk about a legislative agenda, and there's a whole range of things in addition to, COVID relief bill. There's a bunch of electoral infrastructure, a couple of important electoral infrastructure bills that are before the House that we talked about before in terms of, gerrymandering, just a whole range, revitalizing the Voting Rights Act of 1965, HR 1, HR 4. So the question is, I think they'll get out of the House. It's going to be a bit of a fight, but I think they'll get out of the House. Then the question is, what do the Democrats do in the Senate? As these bills start to pile up in the Senate. Now, you can do reconciliation for the COVID relief bill, but everything else is pretty much going to have to you have to deal with the filibuster. What are Democrats going to do when it comes to the filibuster? And so that's a political / substantive question, and I'm not sure, what the answer is there. Will we get the necessary votes to do away with that? Because I think ultimately that is going to be a huge impediment to doing the things that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, want to do.
Terrific. Eric, thanks so much. We've got two other issues we're going to get to right there that you've identified and that are really important. One is kind of what's going to happen to the Republican Party? Where is it headed? And how is that going to affect the landscape? And the other has to do with the filibuster. And we will come back to those. Beto, you're next. What do you think?
I've been thinking a lot, Bernard, about democracy. And, if I look at the career of the other panelists, I think about Donna filing legislation to overturn Citizens United, which essentially said that corporations are people and money is speech, and therefore corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money in an attempt to purchase the outcomes of our elections, or to influence legislation, or to change the very course that this country will take. I think about the Attorney General and his work to protect voting rights. And in fact, the Shelby decision in 2013, where the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is gutted and the requirement for preclearance is ripped away. And in the immediate aftermath in my home state of Texas, you have 750 polling places closed in one of the fastest growing states in the country. And probably no surprise to everyone here, the majority of those polling place closures were concentrated in Black, Mexican-American neighborhoods and communities of color across the state. You have the most onerous voter ID laws in the wake of that decision implemented right here in Texas. You have what a federal panel of judges described as a racial gerrymander of the state, where you try to diminish the power of Black voters to the point that many make the decision not to vote because they understand that it's no longer one person, one vote in the state of Texas. And you have the most recent examples where our governor failed to expand vote by mail in the midst of a pandemic that killed 40,000 of our fellow Texans. And for those wanting to drop off an absentee ballot in person, limited it to one absentee ballot drop-off location per county, which means if you're in Harris County, you might have to drive 50 miles to get to a ballot box. That helps to explain Texas ranking 46th in voter turnout in the country, despite the best turnout we've had in my adult life so far. It's not that we don't love democracy, it's that we're literally drawn that way and people are kept from participating in it. And then Bernard, I can't help but take that into what happened on the 6th of January of this year, where you had not only the president, but those complicit in his conduct attempt to overturn a lawfully, legitimately, democratically decided election. And in an unprecedented attempt at sedition, at a coup and an insurrection that provoked the first successful breach of the Capitol since the war of 1812. And I think there's some temptation on our part to say, well, Joe Biden has been sworn in and it looks like the wheels of government are turning again. And I think that would be a mistake. I think that threat to democracy, whether it's the voting rights challenges and obstacles that you see in Texas, whether it's the insurrection that was aided and abetted by sitting US senators like my junior senator in Texas, Ted Cruz, or whether it's the ongoing fight that you see taking place across this country, this battle is on right now. And I think the answer to this attack on our democracy is in fact more democracy. The Attorney General mentioned HR 1 for the People Act, also Senate Bill 1. This would allow for same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, citizen financing of our campaigns, transparency, restoration of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So many of the things that we need to make sure that our democracy works and every voice is heard and every vote is counted, is counting on that legislation. But critical to that, and I'll end with this in terms of challenges that we need to think about, is a restructure of the rules in the United States Senate. If we continue to require 60 votes to pass this kind of legislation that allows our democracy to work, then not only will we not get For the People Act and a restoration of voting rights, we won't get any other meaningful piece of legislation, whether it's immigration, whether it's climate, whether it's around jobs and a $15 an hour minimum wage, or so many other important priorities. And as Amanda Littman, who started a group called Run for Something, said, look, voters in the year 2022 may not know what the hell a filibuster is, but they will know if the party that had the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives was unable to meaningfully improve their lives. This is an historic opportunity to do that, but we're going to have to see some political courage in the Senate.
Great, thanks, Beto. Thanks for starting us off there. So we've got a lot of things on the table, but I think I want to start there really, and maybe turn it first back to Eric Holder on these questions, because of course that's where that's where our series was born and has been going for the past 13 sessions, really on these questions of the American voter and the right to vote, and the question of gerrymandering and the census. So Eric, where do we stand now with those efforts, given that we do have now a Democratic administration and majorities in terms of dealing with the results of the census and the redistricting and the transformations to the democratic process that might be possible in this moment?
Well, I think the point that Beto made was, I think, is extremely important. We can't simply think that because, the attack on that we survived barely, that attack on our democracy, and that Joe Biden is now president, Kamala Harris is now vice president, that everything's fine. Our democracy was and is under attack. The way in which we say we constitute ourselves as a democracy, that's being challenged. The Republican Party has shown itself to be comfortable being a minority party with majority power. They are okay, in essence, with the creation of a political apartheid system. They gerrymandered, like hell in 2011. Princeton University did a study, said it was the worst gerrymandering of the past 50 years. They're prepared to do the same thing in 2021. They tried to fool around with the census, to try to, fool around with that, so that would help their gerrymandering efforts with regard to the state legislatures and the House of Representatives. And so we have got to be, I think progressives, Democrats have got to be prepared to fight. One of the things that kind of strikes me about progressives and Democrats, it seems to me that we're too often uncomfortable with the acquisition and the use of power. And, the Beto's point, I think, is a good one. We have power now. And come 2022, if this legislation, these transformations, if these restorations are not accomplished, we will have squandered the possibilities, the power, and we'll be held accountable. And in the meantime, we will cede the field to Republicans and allow them to do a whole range of things. If you look at HR 1, it says you should do the redistricting by creating these nonpartisan commissions, right? Fair. Let's take redistricting, line drawing out of the hands of interested politicians altogether. That goes, and that's something that we at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, we have supported that. We think that's the best way to go. that's inimical to what Republicans are trying to do. They're going to try to draw themselves back into the majority. They're going to do things in Texas. They're going to do things in Georgia, the places where they have trifecta control, the governor and then both houses of the legislature. And there has to be a meaningful response to that. And it's not a partisan concern. This is not a partisan thing. This is for our democracy, for the thing that we say makes this nation unique. If we don't fight for it, we will be held accountable, and our democracy will suffer as a result.
And Donna, you've been working on this for forever, really, right? I mean, with the legislation to get rid of Citizens United. And how do you see this situation in terms of the threats to democracy and the potential right now to try and transform something?
Well, we know those threats are substantial. I mean, the crowd that voted to overturn the lawful election, they're still there. And what we're talking about now is a majority of the Republican Party, a majority in the House, and a majority of Republicans in the Senate. And so it's not a surprise to me, for example, that Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise and and Lindsey Graham and all the rest are trotting themselves down to Florida and Mar-a-Lago to kind of what I describe as reconstitute. But those threats are ongoing. And unfortunately, it's also true that it sent a horrible message to the rest of the world, where democracies around the world are also under threat. So we have a lot of work to do. And, when I think about where we go with the legislation, I agree with Eric. I mean, Democrats do seem to kind of take a step back from power. And let's look at the contrast. When Mitch McConnell was majority leader, he had no problem whatsoever using his power. He used it when it came to stopping Eric Garland from moving on to the Supreme Court. He used it again when he rammed through two or one Supreme Court justices. He used that power when he jammed through a tax bill that only benefited a very marginal percent of our public. He had no problem using power. And he also had no problem using power by stopping the impeachment managers from being able to deliver the article of impeachment so that could take place while Donald Trump was still president. Well, we've got to get used to using that same power. And I think it's time for the filibuster to go. I mean, one thing that I do know is that President Joe Biden has the experience of 2008 to 2010, where Democrats held the House, the Senate, and the White House, and then lost it, but didn't just ram through everything that was at the top of the agenda. And at the top of that agenda were actually democracy reforms. And so we can't let those reforms go again on the off chance that we think that if we push them to some later date, that Democrats are going to retain control of the House and Senate. I don't think that we should approach it that way at all. It's time for Democrats. We do need a little bit more spine when it comes to making sure that our legislative priorities, that are really the priorities of the American people. American people actually agree with the reforms that are being proposed, and we should not let a minority in the United States Senate keep that from happening.
Yeah. So back to you, Beto, on this, because I'm really fascinated by this. We do always feel and say that the Democrats don't exercise power or aren't willing to kind of ply it and deploy it the way that the Republicans are. And clearly we saw, as Donna was saying, as Eric was saying, clearly we saw these really, it's sorry to say this, but masterful deployments of deviant and masterful deployments of power, right? I mean, with the blocking Garland and getting through a justice in such a short amount of time. It's amazing to see this. And so what's the story here? Why is it that we all have this impression? Are we stuck with it? How do we change it? I mean, do the Democrats, is it true that the Democrats just don't exercise power in the same way as the Republicans when they're in power?
Yeah, I completely agree with the assessment that Donna and Eric made. And it begs the question, are we just wired that way? Or are we just constitutionally unable, incapable of wielding power effectively and doing the things that need to be done within the time given to us to demonstrate to the American people that we can be entrusted with that power again? And I'd have to go back in time to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and that administration that met a host of challenges that at that time were unprecedented. Obviously, the Great Depression, the rising threat of global fascism, a war on a continent that could very well bring the United States into it, and the vigor and the unabashed ambition that administration demonstrated. The scorn that he welcomed from his enemies. He'd find the middle ground if it were available. If it were not, I welcome your scorn. We're moving forward as a country. Won many of his legislative battles, lost some of them, but undoubtedly moved this country forward and frankly reshaped the way that we think about governance and government and democracy in this country. And you look at one of those heirs of FDR democratic politics, that's Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it was LBJ who was able to help pass the Civil Rights Act. It was LBJ who passed the Voting Rights Act. And he spent that precious capital with which he began his administration, inheriting that from JFK, on those two priorities, knowing full well that he would lose the South, as he famously predicted, except not for a generation, all the way through until, frankly, November of 2020, thanks to Georgia and to the candidates and to Stacey Abrams and to the organizers on the ground who made that victory possible. I mean, that's the kind of principled, ambitious, almost aggressive democratic leadership that I would love to see us return to. What the hell do we believe in? And what are we willing to do in order to achieve that? That's what we need to say, simply, concisely, and directly to the American people. And as Donna and Eric both pointed out, I think the majority of the American people are going to be down with that agenda. They need to see somebody stand up and fight for it.
Yeah.
See, I think that point is really important. I mean, you know, I'm not talking about some kamikaze mission here, you know. We're talking about doing things that are consistent with the desires of the American people. And it's like, I tend to think that if we do things consistent with those desires, that we will be rewarded at the ballot box. And we will do things, I think objectively you can say will be good for our country, good for our democracy, but I think these things will be good for us politically as well. And, you know, trying to reach across the aisle and looking for unity and watering down bills, you know, in a way that they almost become unrecognizable to us, it will first off not be the thing that we stood for and what we're trying to get past, and also will waste valuable time. We have limited amounts of time in which to get all of this done. We don't have 4 years, you know, we got to be thinking in 2 years and maybe only 18 months to try to get these things into law.
Right, yeah. So it's something, in a way, it's something about working on conviction. I mean, when we think about FDR or when we think about LBJ, it's working on a conviction that may not have felt as if it was necessarily going to be the most popular at the time, but in part kind of by pursuing that conviction, it becomes more popular in a way, and gets more support. Yeah.
We're not even pushing unpopular stuff. He's all right. Well, let's have commissions draw the lines. 67% of the people think that's a good idea. Let's expand, you know, Medicaid. Everybody loves that. You know, all the things that are in these bills and the things that, you know, that Beto and Donna fought for, these are things that are popular with the people. It's not like we're going against the people and trying to convince them that these are the right things and they should support them. They're already there. The only thing that's happening here is that the Republicans are frustrating our legislative aims and the desires of the American people.
Right. But then
Bernard, I always get accused of beating up on Democrats. And so I want to try to put this into, into some frame. I'm sure, Beto and Eric, you've heard the same thing. But I do think it's actually important that one of the things that President Biden is doing right now is redefining the idea of unity. What does unity mean? What is unity? What does it mean to have a unified American public, rather than talking about this sort of false political unity? Because I think that by reframing what unity means, it actually could help to use that bully pulpit to move forward the things that the American people already care about. And so I think that's actually a positive that's come out of this environment. And I would say to Democrats, run with that.
Doesn't it all turn, though, on the question that Eric raised, which is about the filibuster? I mean, is it going to be possible to do any of this without getting rid of the filibuster? And what do you think, Donna? And then I'll go to Beto.
I think it's going to be very difficult to do. I mean, there will be a reconciliation that will take place that will help move forward the COVID relief package. But I think right after that, whether it comes to immigration reform, these democracy reforms that we're talking about, moving forward on climate change, all of these priorities are going to require, if the filibuster is not removed, are going to require that 60 vote margin. And what I would say if I were, anybody that anyone would listen to, I'd say, well, what you need to do, test out your theory of trying to get 60 votes. When you realize that you can't do it, just stop it already and get rid of the filibuster. Because I think that without that, the Biden-Harris administration is just going to be stymied, and simply relying on executive orders to do things that ought to be law is not going to be a solution to the long-term problems that we face.
Yeah. Beto, what do you think?
Two thoughts. One, I love that Donna connected this conversation that I maybe took too far into the past with FDR and LBJ into this present moment. But I think this moment rhymes with our history in that we're facing these unprecedented crises, whether it's to our democracy, to climate, or the fact that we have a pandemic which has affected the entire world. And though we're only 4% of that world's population, we represent, I think, a fifth of the deaths across this planet. If ever there were a moment that would justify bold leadership in that mold, or perhaps creating a new one, it is this one. And I really do think that the Biden-Harris administration have this extraordinary opportunity that, as Eric said, will only last maybe not even 2 years, maybe 180 days in terms of what that window of opportunity is. But through that window, take everything that you possibly can. The second thing that I wanted to say in terms of your specific question, the filibuster, if I think about what made the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act possible, yes, LBJ, then the master of the Senate, using that skill in a way to make that legislatively possible has a lot to do with it. But in some way, he was forced to do that by the court of public opinion. And those who changed that public opinion through their extraordinary acts of courage and bravery. I mean, all of us are thinking about John Lewis when we think about democracy, or Fannie Lou Hamer, or the students at North Carolina A&T, or others who risked or lost their lives to ensure that this democracy would truly reflect and represent everyone. And that galvanized public opinion. It shocked the conscience of the country. And really the credit is owed to them. Just LBJ was such a great politician that he could channel it and sense it and feel it and work it and then bring it to conclusion, at least in those two bills. I really think, and I don't think this is a stretch, that Joe Biden's extraordinary capacity for empathy, which we all know about, and the resolute leadership he has already shown, and his previous experience in the Senate, as Donna said, in the White House, I think all of that could produce the environment necessary for him to make the most of the moment in that same way. Now, the missing part might be that public pressure, that public sentiment. As Eric said all this stuff polls really well, but is there the pressure out on the streets, in the congressional offices, on the town halls, in the Capitol switchboard? That I don't know. And that, of course, is on all of us, not just our elected leaders. All of us must produce that pressure that changes the calculus by those political leaders. But I think Biden is capable of carrying that if those conditions will develop.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big problems here, I take it, though, is that, I mean, so the pandemic, which is such a horror and has affected so many Americans and killed so many, like 500,000 Americans. I mean, it's such a horror. The additional kind of horrible dimension of it, in a way, is that it then kind of preoccupies the political landscape right now, necessarily, of course. I mean, it's the most important thing to deal with right now, but it means dealing with the rollout of the vaccine, dealing with trying to pass a stimulus package addressed to the economic problems caused by the pandemic. And all of that work, which is what's most necessary and compelling right now, also in a way doesn't create much space for the other positive programming that needs to be done, in a way, expanding healthcare, thinking about all of the other things that a positive program, if we weren't in COVID times, that a Democratic Party could go after. Many of the criminal justice reforms, et cetera. So how do we think about that, in the sense that, how much of the Biden-Harris agenda are we going to be able to get to when right now we are facing the urgency of passing a stimulus bill, which, of course, the stimulus bill is part of the agenda, but it's a reactive part of the agenda, in the sense that it's reacting to this terrible moment, instead of kind of being a forward-facing, transformative legislation that's going to get universal health care or something like that. That's one of the tricky situations we're in right now. Is it going to be possible, assuming Biden-Harris can get through the stimulus package and those kind of temporary measures, is it going to be possible to also pivot towards the more forward-looking ones? Eric, do you want to start us off with that?
Well, that's a question I think in some ways directed more to the folks who've actually served in Washington. But as a person, I mean, in the legislative branch, but as a person who's been in Washington, and I think kind of an involved citizen, and also a member of an administration that I think made a mistake when we started out, where we focused so much on getting the healthcare bill passed, Obamacare, and clearly a signature achievement, something for which I think President Obama will be, seen wonderfully by history. But we put everything else off. I wanted to talk about criminal justice reform. I wanted to talk about the assault weapons ban. There were politically problems with that, I suppose. But it was all wait. Second term, end of the first term, we got to get healthcare. And so, yeah, we have to focus on the pandemic. We have to focus on the economy. But I think that there is the capacity to focus on other things as well. That, I don't know, maybe congressmen have got to come in and work 5 days a week instead of 3. I mean, it seems to me that there are processes, procedures, and you've got, multiple hearings going on at the same time. I have to think that we have a capacity to multitask in a way that I don't think the system is used to doing, but that's what leadership is about. I got to think that if Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi want to push and really kind of, advance on a whole bunch of fronts, I think that that's possible. There will be Republican obstruction. There's no question about that. But I think that they just have to try to push through that. And I think all of these things, I don't think we have to just focus on one and then the next and then the next. I think we can do a lot of these things at the same time. But again, I would defer to those who served in the legislative branch. They can say, "Oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about."
Yeah. All right. So Donna, why don't you help us figure this out here then?
Sure. I don't know, but I have a little bit different perspective, and it is this. I think one of the challenges around the focus on the Affordable Care Act is that I think we stretched it out way too long, waiting for that consensus, trying to figure out how to get across the other side of the aisle. And that stretched out so far that it really consumed the administration. I thought it was a good win once we finally got it, but then the politics couldn't really hold on to it. I also don't believe in assuming that we're going to get another bite at the apple in 2 or 4 years. Because our history and experience tell us that those midterm elections that are coming up could well cost us the House or the Senate or both. And so I want to assume that we have to operate under an environment where we got to get stuff done now. And the reason that I think this environment is different than others that we've experienced is because I think Joe Biden is going to get an early win. He is going to get that COVID relief package. And I don't know whether it's going to be 1.9 trillion or 1.3 or whatever, but he's going to get a significant win, which means he's also going to have his, the wind at his sails, moving toward that next win. And I think the importance of having something in your pocket puts you in a better political position in terms of pressing, especially Republicans. And if they won't be pressed, given that you got the win, then you move them out of the way. The public will expect that. The public is going to be behind him. And so I think we have a really different environment that actually opens up an opportunity to move forward some of these really important legislative opportunities.
Okay, all right. What do you think, Beto?
I totally agree. There was a lot made of shifts that we saw in voting patterns across Texas in this most recent presidential election. Why, for example, did so many counties along the border that are not just Mexican-American majority, but 95% Mexican-American, or in El Paso where I am, 85% Mexican-American, why did they shift more towards Trump? This is the city in 2019 where a Trump-inspired gunman killed a number of people for the sole reason of repelling the invasion of Hispanics, basically quoting Donald Trump, inspired by him to do that. These are the communities that witnessed kids in cages and family separation. And in fact, the deaths of 6 children who were in the custody and care of Border Patrol. How do you explain that? And I think, Donna's point has a lot to do with it. When you are out of work, 4 million Texans having filed unemployment claims, when you're having a hard time feeding your family, when you just got a check signed by this guy, Donald Trump, when you just picked up a box of food with a letter from Donald Trump in it at the food bank, when Donald Trump and the GOP frankly ate our lunch in terms of messaging, it's jobs or public health. If you're going to feed your family, it's jobs every single time. Now, the challenge for us is how are you honest and ethical and retaining your moral compass and still campaigning in a far more compelling way than we traditionally have? How do we get away from trying to ascertain how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and talking about whether it's a public option or whether you buy it on the market or it's expanding Obamacare, it's Medicare? I'm going to get you healthcare. I'm going to make sure you can see a doctor, fill that prescription. You have a sick kid, you're not going to have to worry about it. We're going to get them a doctor. We're going to get them care. So I think Donna's right. We've got to see early wins. I think Biden and Democrats in the House and Senate will be able to follow through on that. And then we have to talk about it in a clear, concise, and compelling way. And that lays the path for other bigger, more important structural wins that we've got to achieve.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So let's turn our focus a little bit then to the Republican Party right now. Eric, you had raised this question. What kind of political party are we going to be facing with the Republican Party and the rift right now going on between Trump and McConnell? And so back to you, Eric, on this question. I realize this is a little bit, reading tea leaves and things are moving fast, and oddly, McConnell finds himself in a position where he must be second guessing himself for not voting for impeachment at this point, right? But what do you think? What do you see? What's your vision of where you see the Republican Party headed now?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I think somehow, some way, I just assume that they'll keep themselves enough of a party that they'll prove to be a formidable opponent in 2022. What happens to these big donors that they have? I mean, if McConnell is over here and the Trump folks are over there, do corporations and do they contribute to those people who are on the Trump side? I don't know. I mean, again, I defer to the legislative folks in that regard. There are some questions I think that they have to resolve. But I think one of the things that at the end of the day will unite them is the desire for the acquisition and use of power. And somehow, some way, this spat that they are in, I assume is going to get, I don't know, somehow resolved or at least papered over such that they will present a coherent, powerful force come 2022.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Donna? I mean, this is a tough one, obviously. Where this is kind of crystal ball, but
yeah, and I'm no expert on the Republican Party. Let me admit that.
But this is a significant rift, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, McConnell's statement about Trump was pretty rough. It's hard to imagine just a kind of kumbaya coming together at this point. What do you think, Donna?
On that statement, I think McConnell has actually painted himself into his own self-made box. It is true that he made that statement on the floor of the Senate. It was strong. It was compelling. Joe Biden repeated it in his statement. Lots of people have been, talking about it. But at the same time, he's the one who actually created the conditions that led to them not being able to being able to hang their hat on this, constitutionality argument that really wasn't an argument at all and wasn't supported by most constitutional scholars. So I just have a hard time believing that Mitch McConnell was doing anything but speaking to his donors, his corporate donors, in the hopes that they would say, we're going to pick your side. The challenge for McConnell is that on the Trump side, that's sort of the base of the party, which is based on racism and xenophobia and homophobia and all of the other phobias that you can name. And they're all right with that. They're okay with that. And it turns out that a majority of the House and the Senate Republicans are okay with that kind of party as well. And so I don't think McConnell is going to be able to thread this needle. And in fact, you heard what he said afterwards. He said, I'm about winning elections and I'm going to run, candidates I think are electable. And some of those might be candidates that are identified by Donald Trump. That tells you the crassness of the politics of Mitch McConnell. The problem is that the base of their party is not going to fall for that. So I just don't know really how you put the Republican Party back together again. I think it's really broken, and it may be irreparably broken.
Beto, you're nodding. You're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself agreeing with Donna on all of her points. I'd add this, especially in the wake of January 6th. If there's no real accountability for Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley or any of the other Republicans who aided and abetted this attempt at sedition, then we will have set the precedent that you can get away with this stuff without any real consequence or price to pay. And we will also invite further attempts to extra constitutionally or undemocratically seize power. It kind of gets back to Eric's question at the outset. Are Democrats comfortable with holding and using power? And I just add to that, are we comfortable at stopping these naked attempts to violently and unlawfully seize power? And I mean violently. This proliferation of people carrying AR-15s and AK-47s to political events. And I saw it in almost every county of Texas that I visited. I saw it out on the campaign trail across the country. You saw it on the state house steps in Michigan. You saw it in Pennsylvania. You saw it in Virginia. You saw it in Kentucky. That stuff is not for show. We now know that after January 6th. So we have a party that has embraced sedition and is complicit in their silence when they don't call it outright, or when they do not call for those who committed sedition to pay a price. We have a party on our hands that is operating outside of democracy, outside of the Constitution, outside of the rule of law. And again, kind of to this point that we hit earlier, please do not think that just because Joe Biden was successfully sworn in on the 20th of January, we are past this threat and this challenge. I think it only grows. We probably all read some of the essays that Timothy Snyder, who wrote On Tyranny, has written about this moment, and kind of puts it in the context with other historical, rise of fascism, of tyranny, of authoritarianism. You look at 1923 and the beer hall push. It's 10 years later that Hitler becomes chancellor of Germany. That big lie that is flourishing and being fostered by today's Republican Party, that has a long half-life and will be with us until we absolutely decide intentionally and with true focus that we are going to stop it. So I think this is really kind of a mortal question, an existential question for democracy, not even just for partisan advantage for Democrats. And I think that's how serious that is.
Mm. I don't think that point can be emphasized enough. I think Beto really makes a very, very important point. I mean, I think the polls that I've seen say about 75% of the Republican Party, they actually think the election was stolen from Donald Trump. Now, you imagine that. If you literally believe that to be true, there's a whole range of things that you can legitimately, again, given your misperceptions, that you can legitimately sign up to, that you actually think you're defending democracy by doing these extra democratic kinds of things. I mean, outside the system, 75% of the Republican Party thinks the election was stolen, in spite of court cases and studies and everything. They believe that this actually happened. And if that feeling is there, this is not a feeling that's going to simply go away over the course of, because Joe Biden's been sworn in, or over the course of the next couple of years. This is something we're going to be dealing with for many, many years. And if we're not forceful in dealing with it, what we have seen in other countries in other times could be our fate. I mean, the reality is that you think about Europe in the middle part of the 20th century, I would say that, fascism didn't rise because it was strong, but because democracies were weak. And that's another reason why, again, I think, the acquisition and use of power by progressives, Democrats, is something that we can't run away from. We have got to guard, our systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and I think to Beto's point as well, that this phenomenon is going to exist beyond Donald Trump, because, as Eric said, I mean, it's so embedded now into millions of people that an election was stolen and that only they have the power to correct that. And that is a phenomenon that exists whether Donald Trump decides to reinvent himself or not.
Mm-hmm. So how are we going to deal with this? And here I'm going to start integrating some of the questions, extraordinary questions we're getting from our students and listeners. Maria Tamburo was on this already at 6:12 earlier. How do we move forward? And I believe Maria's in general studies. How do we move forward when so many people have a complete separate set of alternative facts that they are believing is true, right? And Peter Trevino, also general studies 22, says, that question goes to the heart of the problem. What will it take to influence and adjust the acceptance of factual information among those who are so practiced in denying, refusing, and twisting it to fit their incorrect worldviews. So what? How are we going to do this? I mean, I think we're all in agreement of the danger and the extraordinary danger. I mean, you know, when we're talking about, you know, mid 20th century, I mean, you know, it doesn't get more dangerous than that, right? Rise of fascism, the rise of, I mean, how are we going to change this, get rid of these alternative facts, make people question their belief in this big lie? Beto, where do we start?
I think it comes back to democracy. And I think the cure for this is bringing more of our fellow Americans into our government. If it's really going to be of, by, and for the people, then it's got to be all the people. And again, I mean, I would defer to the other panelists because they've done such extraordinary work on this issue. But you know, extending voting rights to every American and making sure that there are no barriers to participation. You know, in Texas, you know, the biggest swing state in the country, you cannot register to vote online. You can register to vote through a volunteer deputy registrar who has to get certified by their county of residence, or you can go down to the Elections Administration Department and file it there. This is in the 21st century, and that's on top of all the other challenges that I described earlier. Imagine this state, among the most diverse in the United States. You know, you've got the largest Vietnamese-speaking language population in the world outside of Vietnam, in Houston, Texas, where that school district speaks 142 different languages in the classrooms. You have this proud immigrant state from the world over, people who have chosen us and made their home in the state of Texas, and yet so many, because of race or ethnicity or country of national origin, or frankly, poverty in so many instances, are unable to affect the course and the direction that their government will take, and much less stand for office. So what Eric said about the importance of HR 1S1 for the People Act, the ability to have nonpartisan boundaries drawn for our representative districts, same-day voter registration, all of that, I think, Bernard, is so much the cure. Because unlike other big monumental divisions in our country's history, you think of the Civil War, you had a defined end to it. There was Appomattox. Your side lost. This is over. This is the course that we're taking right now, at least through the end of Reconstruction in the South. You don't have that settlement. And as Eric pointed out, you have millions of our fellow Americans who believe in the grievance and big lie that an election was stolen from them. I don't know that we change their minds. I don't know that we fix all of those underlying positions or problems. I think we bring a lot more people in who so far have gone unrepresented. That at least would be what I think we should do to help solve this.
Mm-hmm. Does it also involve work at the lower level? In other words, at the municipal, at the state level. In other words, not at the kind of national politics level, but also changing something about the way in which politics play out at more of a state and local level as well. Beto?
Yeah, so look at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee and the work that they're doing on state house and legislative races. This is really where the lines are drawn, the battle lines for the next decade. And Texas, this extraordinarily beautiful, diverse state, will continue to have essentially minority white male Republican rule for the foreseeable future until we begin to have fairly drawn districts, or we have enough help for those challengers to the incumbents who are working against not just the power of incumbency, but lines drawn to their advantage. So yes, the state house races are critical, and then building that bench of candidates in the county commissioners court races, or the school district races, or the city council, or the water board races. All of that is important. And last thing, Bernard, in this abject failure of leadership that you're seeing in Texas, where the power's out, the water's off, people are dying of exposure right now in this state that is the energy capital of North America. I think that the very low bar of competence in governance is being demanded right now. And you see that at the local level. The county judges in Harris County and Dallas County, mayors, aldermen, and alderwomen, they're the ones who are delivering service where the rubber meets the road for government. So I think that's a great point. I think that may be where we begin to restore some faith in democracy and government, and that's at the very local level.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, the redistricting is really important to this, to the way in which this multi-million majority in this country at the last presidential election, gets reflected in the, electoral college map in a way. Because, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about today, in part, there's this disconnect between actually what's going on at the popular level, as Eric was saying earlier, right? A lot of this is very popular, and yet, nevertheless, it because of the electoral college, because of the way in which the districts are districted, it doesn't always show up with the final results, right? So Eric, take us to the redistricting right now. So on the census, I take it there was an effort by the previous administration, for instance, to get rid of persons to not count persons who are not legally documented. And I take it that's not going to happen at this point as a result of the delays and the fact that it got pushed into February and now March and April. So what are we seeing in terms of likely redistricting and changes at the political level as a result of census changes?
Well, I mean, they tried to do all that they could to jimmy the census by trying to include a citizenship question on the census form. We beat them in court in that regard. We sued them when they tried to keep undocumented people out of the count with that executive order. And kind of some unsung heroes here are the career people in the Census Bureau who didn't give in to political pressure and who said, we're not going to be in a position to do an accurate count unless we have more time. Because of the pandemic, they didn't have the ability to get into the field and do all the questioning, do all the field work that they wanted to do. And so now it's been pushed back. I think we'll see things in June or July. The reapportionment data comes out. The actual numbers with regard to, each state that's used for redistricting happens like in September. I think it's a good thing that these delays have occurred, not the least of which is because the numbers that will go to the states will come from the Biden administration as opposed to the Trump administration. And it's clear to me that, Wilbur Ross and Donald Trump, when they got those numbers and sent them to the states, they were going to do all that they could to, advantage the Republican Party. So I think the census is in as good a shape as it can be, given the understandable delays that they had. One of the concerns I have is that Republicans don't use these delays to try to run another round, do redistricting or run another round of elections on the basis of the old numbers, before the new numbers are actually put out there, or somehow try to use these delays to truncate the amount of time that is used to actually do the redistricting and exclude people from the process, the people from the process, decrease the amount of transparency that should go into it. So these are all the kinds of things that, that we're going to be watching. But I think the census is actually in pretty good shape, and at least the foundation for a possible fair redistricting is in place.
How did the pandemic affect that, do you think? I mean, all the difficulties of actually counting people. I mean, is that going to have I mean, it could cut in either way. Obviously, it's in part the pandemic was a bit of a random factor, but how do we think it's actually going to affect and tilt in a certain way the census from 2020?
Well, the census folks say that the places that are traditionally undercounted, poor folks, people of color, those are the places where they need to send people in. That's what they need to do field work. And the pandemic prevented them from doing that field work. They say there are scientific ways in which they can compensate for that. My guess is that the compensation will not get us to the place where we might have been had we had a really robust field effort. And so then it'll be the responsibility of localities and states to come up with ways in which they try to augment that which the Census Bureau has done. So I'm still concerned about the accuracy of the count, especially when we're talking about those communities that traditionally have relied on field work to be counted.
Okay, let me start interjecting some of the questions that are coming in from our students. One, these are great questions. They're in the Q&A. One of them has to do with the judiciary. One person's asking, how can we remedy Trump's record number of judicial appointments across the country and on the Supreme Court, and what's that really going to look like? Maybe Eric, you might be in the best position to kind of address that one.
Well, we've not had an expansion of the federal judiciary for, 20, 30 years. And there are needs. I mean, forget about politics. There are simply needs that exist in district courts around the country, courts of appeals around the country that need to be expanded. And so putting together a study group, commission, whatever, and it wouldn't take, much time. This is not something that needs to be 9 months or whatever. You can do this in 30, 45 days. Just kind of look at case counts, amounts of time it takes to get a case to trial in a district court for decision in the courts of appeals, and then use that, the expanded number of judges that I think the numbers will ultimately show are justified, and appoint, progressive, non-ideological, progressive but non-ideological. I mean, not the kind of conservative wackos that Trump tends to put on the bench, but to put people on the bench who will, follow the rule of law, who will have a different view of the world than the folks who Trump did. And in a lot of ways, you can blunt that which Trump did. And when it comes to the Supreme Court, there's another one of those questions. 2 appointments that did not follow traditions. And I think some of these people tend to forget, if Merrick Garland had gone on the bench when he was nominated by President Obama, there would have been 4 years of a progressive Supreme Court, 4 years. And there's a whole range of decisions that happened during those 4 years that would have come out, I think, in a different way. But for instance, not holding open the federal courts for partisan gerrymandering cases, the Lucio case, the Janus case that weakened, labor unions. Those, I think, would have gone in different ways. And so expanding the court is something I think that has to be considered. But again, that is not something that's going to happen without, killing the filibuster.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. And actually, we've heard a lot less about the idea of, packing the court, the Supreme Court at this point. There's a lot of talk about it right after the appointment of the last justice, but I think that's receded, I think, in the conversation.
It's receded until we start seeing these decisions coming out of this 6-3 conservative majority, when it starts talking about a woman's right to choose. You're talking about Second Amendment stuff. Hold on, don't think that the hue and cry for expansion, I suspect, will start up again.
Okay, all right. I got a question, I think, for Donna that would be really good to get at, and in part it picks up on our earlier discussion of kind of looking at the state and local elections as well. So one person is asking, what are our plans to focus on winning seats in state and local governments rather than just the national stage? We saw Stacey Abrams' impact inspiring people in Georgia. How can we focus her lead in other states? And why do the Democrats so often overlook these vital elections as Republicans have strategically campaigned to win them? What do you think, Donna?
Such a good question. Actually, when you look at what happened, even this last election in 2020, looking at the House races, there are places, obviously, we lost a number of House seats, but you go down to the state legislatures, there were potential opportunities in state legislatures in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina, and some other states, and we weren't able to seize on those opportunities. I actually think, because my other hat is doing some work for a group of foundations that work on civic participation and democracy issues, that there is a rather robust movement going on in states focusing NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, in working on training and developing candidates at the state and local level, and really focusing on, for example, on district attorneys, focusing on mayors, focusing on county council and school boards. And that's really important, because one of the things that I think especially Democrats have lacked is really that pipeline that can lead up to national and statewide office. But it has to be invigorated. And I would say if there's a, sort of a failure of the Democratic kind of party structure, it is really ignoring those state and local races that could change, state legislatures, that could change capitals, that could change school boards. So I'd like to see a lot more focus on that. And I do want to point to one thing that Beto mentioned earlier, and it's that I actually don't feel like we finished litigating the Civil War. And I think that over this last 4 years, we've seen that. And I don't think that that means that 75 million people are, sort of down for all of that garbage, but we still have a pretty resilient 35%, 30%, a third of the country that is still litigating that Civil War. And I think until we really address those issues that are related to race and inclusion and structures and systems, that we are going to continue to face this in this country, whether it's this generation or the next generation.
Yeah. And that's a great point, Donna. I think, and let's talk about that for a minute, because actually there feels as if there's a backlash going on right now. I sense, and maybe I'm also I follow politics a lot elsewhere as well. It's certainly in certain European countries there's a backlash against. It almost feels as if there's a backlash against anti-racism right now, or at least I'm starting to feel this way in which the way people talk about cancel culture right now, which is becoming a bit of a buzzword. I mean, I think it's becoming a bit of a buzzword of the right now to kind of critique anti-racism efforts and other kind of proactive efforts at trying to correct some of this racial horror history that we have in this country. So how do we deal with that as we try to push the country towards a more racially just country, really with the sense of a backlash? Donna, then maybe Beto, what do you think? I mean, do you sense a backlash too?
Yeah,
no?
I'm not sure I completely have the answer to this. What I will say is, and we've touched on it in this discussion of the census, the demographics of the country are changing. They are shifting. The country is becoming more Black and more brown. That in itself, I think, has created what we think of as a backlash, but really what it is, it's this core pushing against a country that is changing and shifting under their ground. And because of the demographics, it is at some point, and in so many states, it will in fact be our destiny. And then how we as a majority of a country of color at some point or other, how we actually handle that minority, I think will speak volumes to the way that we understand our history, and we project that in terms of the ways that we use power, that we use our ability of inclusion. But I think that is the rub of what is happening in this country, is the demographic shift that is inevitable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Beto, what do you think?
I was thinking about what Donna just said and her earlier point about the Civil War and the fact that there really wasn't ultimately a resolution to that. And I think about this, if you all caught Senator Cruz's comments on the floor of the Senate on the 6th of January, when he was making his case to his fellow senators and by extension to the rest of the country, about why this election should be stopped or stalled or overturned outright, he pointed to the Compromise of 1877, the Tilden-Hayes Compromise, which basically said, to the South, to the white men of the South, do what you want as long as we can have the presidency, the Republican Party. And it, effectively put the death knell on Reconstruction. And I can, just as a Texan, see the history from then, from the poll tax to 1923, the Texas state legislature, in law, in black and white, institutes the all-white Democratic primary. And in Texas, as through much of the South, there was only one party. It was the Democratic Party. And by letter of law, as a black man or a black woman, you could not vote in the state of Texas. And it took Dr. Lawrence Nixon, who filed the first case that made it all the way to the Supreme Court, 20 years until 1944 to break the all-white primary. And that, of course, is then succeeded by other measures to try to stop Black Americans and then, by extension, Mexican Americans and communities of color from fully participating democratically, economically, civically, in any way that you can imagine. And to some degree, we're seeing that today in Texas in 2021. Our governor named 5 priorities for this legislative session. None of them is COVID, by the way, but one of them is, quote unquote, election integrity or voter fraud. That, as we know, is the dog whistle to keep people out of our democracy. So again, I agree with Donna. I do think we need to know our history if we're going to make it as a country in our future. And that's a very, very important thing for us to focus on and understand. It helps explain where we are right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that the point that Donna made is right. I mean, there's a demographic anxiety that the status quo feels, and that has to somehow be dealt with. But I don't think that we should understand that although the numbers are going to change, they are anticipating that, and they're putting in place structures to deal with this emerging America. Some of the things are just there. The Electoral College, the Senate, that's just there. But voter suppression, gerrymandering, racial as well as partisan. Those are structures they're trying to put in place, again, to try to maintain power. And one of the things, the question was, well, how do we deal with it? Well, I think we have to fight for, a fair system. But I'd also say, and I don't want him to get too big ahead here, we've got to have candidates like Beto, who I thought, boy, in his presidential run, he talked as forthrightly and as frankly about race in a way that I don't think if you had said 4 years ago, any candidate who wants to be president can speak this forthrightly about race. He did. And I think that stood him in good stead. And I think actually that's kind of the foundation for, for ultimate success in politics. And so what he did in 2020 has got to be emulated by people, not only at the presidential level, but at the state and local levels as well. That kind of frankness, that kind of willing to take on those difficult questions of race that we are so expert at avoiding.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think Beto was remarkable in the campaign, and I think it was also there were echoes, and there were others as well. Kamala Harris was really forthright and really strong on and confronting folks about it. So I think that was great to see a kind of a conversation emerging, although I really do agree here that a lot more needs to be said and a lot more needs to be understood, particularly about the ways in which, and to a certain extent, the January insurrection brought it really to our face, because I think it's right, as Beto was suggesting, the parallels to 1876 and 1877 were just all over there. I mean,
they were carrying the Confederate flag into the Capitol.
I know.
Exclamation point.
Right. But everything that Trump was doing in terms of kind of contesting the transition there. I mean, it was a transition that was the only parallel was to Tilden-Hayes, and to the end of Reconstruction, and I think that we saw that clearly with the insurrection. So, and I just want to give a hat tip to Jasmine Ekiona, who actually raised this question for us. I mean, so as we were talking about it, she was actually asking, with the changing in demographics in the traditional red blue states withering away, how do we see this changing politics in the US? So thanks, Jasmine, for asking the question, which we basically just kind of addressed. I've got another question that goes to social media and news companies, which I think is really important. Particularly, so they've played such. The question is about them playing such a major players in creating and spreading the alternative facts and the big lie. That's right, and also remarkably, with Trump being kicked off Twitter and others as well, it feels as if the whole discourse in this country has almost changed somewhat. It's been kind of mercifully chastened in a way with Trump off of Twitter. And it's so what a phenomenon that has been, that actually Trump created this direct communication to his followers through social media, right? Making possible things that would never have been possible without Twitter, right? No president had ever had such an unfiltered ability to say absolutely outrageous things at 3:20 in the morning when no advisor was there to say, wait a minute, let's not do that. That's going to cause a problem, right? It's just like, it was this direct thing, creating this direct channel, changing the way communication works in politics. Now I find it tragic. Half of the politicians are now kind of doing things on Twitter. I mean, it's like, most of the news reporting now is about what somebody said on Twitter. It's like, really? But anyway, so there was the Trump, and then the silencing, right? The amazing power to silence that happened when they just pulled the plug on his Twitter account. How do we think about that, Eric? In terms of kind of, free speech questions also, which obviously are raised in this context.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Twitter, I mean, Trump was in our heads, and you take Twitter away from him, and levels of anxiety, I think, around the country have gone down pretty substantially. You look at the documented misuse of Facebook by foreign actors, as well as people in the country. There's a real power that social media has that I think has to be used responsibly. I'm not a big heavy duty regulator. I'm not for that, but yet if they don't do things voluntarily to kind of clean up their act, I think it's inevitable that you will have movements or measures passed to try to pull them into an area of responsibility. And I think it's interesting because you may get the left and the right in the same place, but for different reasons in terms of trying to harness or somehow control what's going on in social media. So powerful, misused, and there's a greater need, I think, for responsibility there.
Yeah. Donna, what I mean, there wasn't the same. It wasn't the same world politically. I take it before Twitter, right? I mean, it's a whole new political communication discourse, isn't it?
It is. I was just thinking, I do a lot of television, and it wasn't really until Donald Trump started using Twitter in the way that he did and at any given hour that I remember going into studios where people then routinely, commentators bring their devices with them into the studio, because at any given moment, and I can even point to occasions when I'd be on air and literally right then a tweet would come forward and there would have to be a response to it. That was a Trump era phenomenon. That did not happen before. On the other hand, I think that while he's not on Twitter, this idea that somehow he's going to be silenced, there is going to emerge another platform. I don't know what it is, but that's the way these things happen. Twitter is kind of one platform, and actually right now speaking to a particular demographic, and there will be another one that will emerge, and he'll be right back in it. I also think we haven't, these social media entities are policing themselves because they don't want to be regulated. But I don't know how long that self-policing is going to last. I'm a real skeptic as to whether it is going to last for very long.
Right. And also whether there are going to be other platforms that become as savvy and popular as Twitter, right?
Right.
So whether there are going to be alternatives. I mean, we do see substitution effects. I mean, that's, in economics and pretty much in politics as well. And so it's hard to imagine we're not going to be pretty soon again kind of dumped into this space of, direct communication as much. I mean, right now it's these press releases that I see coming out from Mar-a-Lago right now, which seem to be actually written with a little bit more English than the tweets. But pretty soon I would imagine we'll be back there. Okay, I've got so we're running out of time. We have extraordinary set of questions, which unfortunately they're just I'm getting flooded with questions. I'm not going to be able to ask them all. I do want to shout out to Ayan Kent, who really likes the energy that's being created today. So thanks, Ayan. Beto, I've got a few really kind of interesting ones for you. Are you going to run for governor? I think maybe I'll summarize all of the Beto specific ones by saying, so what's up for the coming couple of years here?
So first of all, thank you for asking me to be part of this, and to be able to join Eric and Donna is just a huge, huge honor. I really love what I'm doing right now. I'm teaching an undergraduate course at Texas State in San Marcos.
That's great.
And I'm teaching a graduate course actually on voting rights, and would love to have Donna and Eric's advice on this at the LBJ school at the University of Texas, and just so fulfilled and happy doing that. We also have a group called Powered by People that works on voter registration and removing the barriers to voting in Texas. And actually right now, we've organized our thousands of volunteers around making wellness check call-ins to senior citizens across Texas. And speaking about social media platforms, through Twitter and Facebook, we've organized these volunteers who've made more than 500,000 phone calls just over the course of the day, checking on people to make sure they have shelter and heat and water and food and transportation if they need it. So I feel very fortunate to be doing all this, and I want to focus on that. What role I can play to be constructive and helpful going forward, I hope that becomes obvious in the future. But right now, very grateful for what I get to do.
Great. Thanks. And thanks for joining us. And everyone, thanks for joining us. Donna Edwards as well. And of course, Eric Holder. Eric, do you want to close us out tonight with some final thoughts to help us get through these next few months of the pandemic before everybody's vaccinated?
Yeah, well, first, let me just thank Beto and Donna for joining us this evening. I don't know what your plans are for either of you going forward, but my selfish desire, and I think it's a desire on the part of the country, that I hope you both find a way back into public life. You all were sterling examples of what great representatives of our democracy should be all about. As I was talking about Beto and Donna, it was true of you as well. Taking gutsy positions, saying things that politicians are not expected, you don't expect to hear from them. That's the kind of thing that ultimately will lead this nation closer to its founding ideals. So I thank you for your service, and I thank you certainly for joining us this evening. I think, Bernard, you always come up with interesting topics, and I think this has been an interesting, 90 minutes or so to talk the things we have talked about here. But I think they're really consequential, and I think that's certainly what you heard from Donna and from Beto. This is a consequential time for our nation, and for us to get through this consequential and potentially negative time, it is going to require the involvement of all of us. It is a good thing that you tuned in tonight, and I hope that you leave this inspired. But then the question is going to be, what are you going to do? Beto talked about how the practical things that his organization is doing. And those are the kinds of things that I think all of us have to be about. It's one of the reasons why Bernard and I worked on this initiative so much, to try to get Columbia University students involved in the lives of the communities in which we live. You know, what is it that you are doing to make this nation better? You're great examples, Donna and Beto, of people who have who really, you know, done significant things. But we all have that capacity. We all have that capacity, and if we are a committed and focused people, all the things that they throw at us will not succeed. The fate of this nation is in our hands if we're willing to work to make it better. So again, thanks everybody for tuning in this evening. Thank you to our guests. And Bernard, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Beto, for joining us. I want to just also thank some essential people who are behind the scenes here. Beth Manchester, who's the Associate Director of the Eric Holder Initiative, and Chris Balmer and Ferran de Mendoza Soler, without whom we wouldn't be having this entire wonderful conversation. So thank you to all of you. Thanks to our listeners and our audience. And thank you to all of these great questions from students. It's been terrific. So with that, I think we'll call it a night with a big thank you and best wishes to Beto and Texans for for dealing with this terrible situation that's going on right now. And we hope to see you all on, I believe it's March 18th is the next time we're going to be getting together for what will be the 15th iteration of the American Voter Project. So thank you all. All right. Good night.
Good night.
And take care. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.